Welcome to Gemara Markings. Today's Shiur is Yuma Daf Samach Vov. We begin today's Shiur halfway down Daf Samach Vov Amud Aleph. You'll notice there is a Mishnah, and this Mishnah actually is rather long. It continues down to practically the end of the Amud. The topic heading that we've assigned to this section on the side of the Gemara, Vidui V'Shiluach So'ir HaMishleach, the confession that is recited by the Kohen Gadol, and the sending out of the goat that is sent on Yom Kippur to a cliff, and it carries with it the sins of Israel. The Rashi points out that this Mishnah is a return to the Seder HaVodah, the order of activities that were done in the Beis Hamikdash. There was an interruption in that flow of Mishnayos, so we're picking up where that was left off, and we had mentioned earlier in the Masechta that they brought the Kohen to the Sorah Mishtalech, where the animal had been standing, and the Lashon of the Gemara there had been Keneged Beis Shilucho. But that was quite a while ago, so we're picking up from that point over here. Bo lo eitzel Sorah Mishtalech. We're at the Mishnah in the middle of the Amud. The Kohen comes to the goat that was at its prearranged position. The somech shtei yodav olav, and the Kohen Gadol places his hands on its head. Umisvade, and he mentions a confession. V'kach hoya omer, and thusly was the confessional. Ono Hashem, a plea to the Almighty. Chotu avu pashu lefanecho amcha beis Yisrael. The Jewish people have sinned different types of sins. Ono Hashem, kaper no lachatoim v'lavonos v'lapshoyim. Please, Almighty, forgive the sins of Israel. Shechotu v'she'avu v'she'poshu v'fanecho, that had sinned in front of you. Amcha beis Yisrael, the nation of Israel. Kakosu b'soros Moshe Abdecha Lemor, as it says in the Torah, Ki b'yom hazeh yichaper alechem v'tayir eschem. On this day, namely Yom Kippur, the Almighty will atone for us, will forgive us. L'tayir eschem, to purify us. Mikol chatoisechem l'fnei Hashem tito, from all of the sins that have been committed in the presence of the Almighty. And the Kohanim and the rest of the people that were in the Beis Hamikdash courtyard, when they would hear the ineffable name of the Almighty, as he would enunciate it, they would bow and prostrate themselves on the floor of the Beis Hamikdash, the Omrim, and they would proclaim, Baruch Shem Kavoid Malchuso Leolam V'ed, praised be the kingdom and the name of the Almighty forever. Mosu Lemisha Hayamolicho, then the Mosro, the Sorah Mishtalech, the goat, the scapegoat, was given over to the one who would Molicho, to walk it outside of the Beis Hamikdash, outside Yerushalayim, to its destination at the cliff east of Jerusalem. Hakol ksherim lolicho, everyone was eligible for this task, namely by letter of the law. It didn't have to be a Kohen, but anyone would have been suitable. Elo she'osu hakohenim gedulim, she'osu hakohenim gedolim keva. The Kohanim Gedolim had established for themselves a practice for lo hoyu manichem es Yisrael olicho, and they did not allow a non-Kohanim to walk it out, to accompany this goat out to its destination. Omer Rabbi Yossi Ma'asav Olicho Arsulav Yisrael Hoya. There was an incident where a gentleman by the name of Arsula, who was a non-Kohen, who did this, who walked it out, the kevesh osulo, and there was a ramp, an elevation that was made that would enable him to leave the courtyard and outside the city, and through this elevated ramp, the assembled people wouldn't have any contact with the goat. Why was this necessary? Because the Babylonians and this will be discussed later who this really is a reference to, but this is a description of a negative practice, that they used to tear out the hair, they would tear out the hairs of the goat, the omrim lo, and demand, told it say, take it and go. They were very impatient, if you will, with any delay. So this is what they used to do, and in order to avoid that situation, this kevesh, this ramp, was made to avoid that contact. We turn to the arrow at the side of the Gemara, at the right-hand side of the Gemara text. You align the arrow that you're about to see with the arrow above. In the confessional, we saw the Kohen Gadol mentioning Amcho Beis Yisrael, atone for the sins, and he's dealing with this Soyer HaMishlech, the send-away goat right now, and he says that it is to atone for the sins of Beis Yisrael. The Gemara says, "Ve'ilu b'nei Aaron am kedoshecha lo kolor." In his confessional, he doesn't make any reference to the sins of the Kohanim, b'nei Aaron, literally the sons of Aaron. The Kohanim are not mentioned here. Man Tana. So who is the author of our Mishnah that suggests the Soyer HaMishtalech was an atonement for Klal Yisrael, with the exception of the Kohanim having their own atonement through the Par Kohen Moshiach, through the Par of the Kohen Gadol, that is. So who is the author of this idea? We have two approaches then who the author of our Mishnah might be. Number one, Omer of Yirmiyah, Delok Rabbi Yehuda. Our Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. The to Rabbi Yehuda, if our Mishnah was in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda, Omar, he has been known to say, and we learned this back on Daf Samach Aleph, that Yesh Lahem Kapora B'Soyer Mishtaleach, that the Kohanim do achieve atonement through the send-away goat. Abaye Omar Afilu Tamer Rabbi Yehuda. Abaye says, our Mishnah that mentions Amcho Beis Yisrael can very well be along the lines of Rabbi Yehuda, who said that the Kohanim receive atonement through the Soyer HaMishtaleach. Atu Kohanim Lav Bichlal Amcho Yisrael Ninu. Are you suggesting in your question that the Kohanim are not part of Amcho Yisrael? They certainly are. The Kohanim are a group within the nation of Israel. So when the Kohen Gadol mentions that the Soyer Mishalech should be a vehicle of atonement for the sins of Amcho Beis Yisrael, that very well includes the Kohanim, in line with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Mosru Lami Shemolicho. The Mishnah mentioned that the goat was then given over to the one who would accompany it out to the tzuk, to the cliff outside of Yerushalayim. The practice, of course, is based on psukim in the Torah, and we are making specific reference to Vayikra, Perek Tez Zayin, Pasuk Chof Aleph. And on the side of the Gemara, we have the quote that's relevant to this section of the Gemara, where the pasuk says, "V'shilach biad ish iti hamidbora," and it is sent out with an appointed man to the desert. And now we break down the pasuk in the following Tanaic source: Tanu Rabbanan ish, the hachshiras hazar. The word ish includes even a zar, a non-kohen as well. Iti, that word. We continue at the top of Omid Beis, Shehei Mezuman. The word et comes from the word ace. Ace means time. And here it means someone that is appointed. Et Vafilu B'Shabbos means you will send him out at its time when Yom Kippur comes out, even if it happens to be Shabbos. Et Vafilu B'Tuma. And that means at its appointed time, even if it's a matter of doing it in a state of defilement. These points, Afilu B'Shabbos, Afilu B'Tumah, will be explained as we go on in the Gemara. We continue now with quotes from this source. Ish lahachshiras azar. The word ish comes to allow even a non-Kohen, and namely that anyone or everyone is eligible for this role of accompanying the animal, the goat, to its destination. The more asks Pshita, it would seem to be obvious. Do we really need a pasuk for that purpose? We're not dealing here with an avoda in the Beis Hamikdash, with a Beis Hamikdash activity. We're not dealing with a sacrificial activity. This send-away goat was not a sacrifice. So what do I need a special scriptural reference to allow a non-Kohen? If you were dealing with a sacrificial act, so that regarding that, the Torah demands only the Kohanim to be engaged in such activities. Not so here. This isn't a sacrificial act. So the Gemara answers, why is it necessary for the Torah to specifically give license and permission for a non-Kohen? Mahu detema. Without this, I would have thought kapora ksiva bei. The Torah uses the word kapora, atonement, in the context of this scapegoat. And since kapora is the term that's used, kapora is associated with sacrificial activity. And I would have thought, because of this word in the context of the Soyer HaMishtaleach, the send-away goat, maybe it is restricted to the Kohanim. Komash Malon, therefore the Torah goes out of its way to say ish, to say not so. Iti, v'afilu b'Shabbos. Again, a quote we saw at the top line, even on Shabbos. L'mai hilchasa, what aspect of the goat accompanying needs a special ruling that it can be done even on Shabbos? In other words, there must be some type of potential Shabbos violation that we are telling you go ahead and violate Shabbos, supersede Shabbos in order for this to be accomplished. So what is that? What aspect of this would demand such a permission from the Torah? Omar Rav Sheshes, Lomar, the Gzeres HaKos of Iti Afilu Shabbos is telling me, She'im hoya chole markivo al ksefo. If the sawyer happened to be sickly, the ish iti, the appointed person, can carry it on his shoulders. And carrying something on Shabbos involves what otherwise would be a Shabbos violation. Carrying it from one domain to another, or carrying something 4 amos in a Rishus HaRabim. Yet, if the animal is sickly, he will be allowed to do that even on a Yom Kippur that coincides with Shabbos. Kaman, this approach that this would otherwise be a Shabbos violation is Dolo Kerebi Yonasan. When the Gemara asks, Kaman, who is this approach like? Well, it's not like Rabbi Yonasan. The Rabbi Yonasan, if it were in line with Rabbi Yonasan's approach to carrying on Shabbos, Ha'omar, Rabbi Yonasan has been known to say, Chai noise es atzmo, a living creature that one carries on Shabbos. You, the carrier, are not said to be in violation of Shabbos, because in carrying something that's alive, the expression literally is translated as the alive thing carries itself. What that means in practical terms might be that since when you are carrying it, it adjusts its weight to accompany for the swaying motion that takes place when you're carrying it. It assists in helping you carry it by this different weight adjustment. Therefore, you are not doing the entire activity by yourself. And in Hilchos Shabbos, there is this idea that an activity that is ordinarily done by one person and 2 people do it, or 2 forces do that one activity, so there is exemption. So Rabbi Yonasan, in terms of carrying a live creature, would have said that one who carries it on Shabbos from one domain to another is not guilty of a Shabbos violation. So as far as Rabbi Yonasan is concerned, you wouldn't need a Gzeres HaKosov, a special scriptural allowance for doing it on Shabbos, even if Yom Kippur coincides with Shabbos. The Gemara here takes a turnaround and says, Afilu Temo Rabbi Yonasan. No, in fact, our Mishnah that says you need a special Shabbos allowance is such even according to Rabbi Yonasan, Cholo Shaini. The fact that the animal is sickly and it needs to be carried it in that state is not considered chai nose es atzmo. In your mind's eye, maybe you can say the animal is sickly and limp, so that the explanation we gave before wouldn't apply to a sickly animal, because it's limp and weak, so it doesn't help you in its being carried. It doesn't adjust itself along the way, and therefore you are the sole carrier of that creature. And as a sole carrier, as a singular performer of this act, that otherwise, without the Gzeres HaKosov, would have been a Shabbos prohibition. Nevertheless, we are telling you that it's Yom Kippur, and this needs to be done under all circumstances, even if the animal is sickly. Omar Rafram, Zoisei Meres, from the fact that we have the Gzeres HaKosov that says E.T. of the Afilu B'Shabbos, and no mention is made of Yom Kippur, it shows us that it's only because of the Shabbos factor that you would need to have a special allowance. If Yom Kippur, let us say, came out in the middle of the week, so you wouldn't need any special permission. You could go ahead and carry it straight away. This shows us, says Rafram, Eruv v'hoitzah l'Shabbos v'ein Eruv v'hoitzah l'Yom HaKippurim. The term Eruv is brought in here parenthetically. That's a point that Rashi makes. So we want to focus on the word hoitzah, meaning that the dinim of hoitzah is the act of carrying items from one domain to another, or carrying something 4 amos in a reshus harabim, in a public thoroughfare. Those halachas are purely Shabbos related, and as far as Yom Kippur itself is concerned, there wouldn't be halachas of hoitzah. Therefore, we come to the conclusion that the Gzeres HaKosov E.T. Afilu B'Shabbos, making no mention of Yom Kippur, suggests that Yom Kippur would otherwise not be bound by hotzah restrictions. The term Eruv, as we said, is brought in. By the way, Rashi seems to indicate that Eruv is a reference to Eruv Chatzeros, which is a rabbinic halacha that was established to serve as a fence, a protection against the halacha of hoitzah. We don't intend to get into any further detail regarding Eruv here. You can see the rest in Rashi. Continuing in the Gemara, Iti ve'afilu betuma. We have a Gzeres HaKosov that says that it shall be carried out even when there is an issue of tuma involved. Well, what role does tuma have here? What preventive aspect would there have been if there was tuma that I need a special Gzeres HaKosov, a special scriptural license to say that the sending out of the goat supersedes tuma? So the question is, like we saw before with Shabbos, Lamai Hilchasa, for what purpose is this Gzeres HaKosov necessary? Omar of Sheshes, Lomar, it comes to tell me, Shem Nitma Mishalcho, if the one who is designated to accompany the animal away became Tomei, if the person became Tomei, we'll say the Ish Iti had become Tomei, Nichnas Tomei La'azora U'Mishalcho. He goes into the temple courtyard, which under ordinary circumstances would be strictly forbidden for someone who is Tomei. He, nevertheless, the Ishiti, if he's Tomei, goes into the temple courtyard where the Kohen Gadol gave over to him the goat. In other words, the procedure of handover of goat from the Kohen Gadol after his confessional to the Ishiti took place in the Azora. So it's necessary then to enter the Azora, and if the Ishiti, the appointed one, happens to be Tomei, so be it. He is allowed to go into the Azor in a state of Tumah. As we go on in the Gemara, we see a long Tanaic source. A series marking appears, a crown shape that we've used here to highlight a series of questions. Rashi, on the side of our Gemara, we have the Nosei Mivneh heading, a topic heading, and structural notes. So we've indicated these crown shapes represent kvutsos shel she'elos, groups of questions, shenishal Rebbe Elazar, that Rebbe Eliezer was presented with, v'lo ono lahem ba'ofen yashir, and he didn't answer them in a straight fashion. Now, when we say he didn't answer them in a straight fashion, there may be two approaches to this. Rashi seems to take the approach, and this is certainly the way the Maharsha understands Rashi, that Rabbi Eliezer simply avoided the questions. We'll see later why, and upon hearing each question, he answers them with something that seems to be totally irrelevant. Again, that seems to be Rashi's approach. The Maharsha disagrees with this, and he has an explanation, a point-by-point explanation regarding each question and each answer that Rabbi Eliezer gave, how Rabbi Eliezer was answering their questions, but in a deliberately unclear fashion. And we'll see later why he didn't answer them directly. Either way, according to Rashi, the answers given to the questions are disconnected from the question. According to the Maharsha, there is an answer, but it's veiled. We're going to go through this Gemara with the Rashi approach, but it is highly worthwhile to look into the Maharsha commentary to see this alternative approach. We continue now in the Gemara. Shalu es Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer was asked the question, Chola mahu shiar kiveu al sefo. If the Soyer Mishalech became ill, is it allowed to be carried on one's shoulders? If you want to connect this to the Gemara that we had just before, so it would be a question with regard to Shabbos. If it got sick and it's a Yom Kippur that coincides with Shabbos, or alternatively, you might take the approach that the dinim of Hoitzah apply to Yom Kippur, unlike the conclusion that Rafram reached before. Either way, the question involves, is it mutter to carry the scapegoat on one's shoulders on Yom Kippur to its destination? Omar Lahem, so Rabbi Eliezer responds, Yochol hu l'arkiv ani v'atem. It can carry me and you. Again, that's a translation, and he seems to be avoiding the basic halachic question posed to him. Rashi says, Yochel arkiv ani vatem bori v'chozokoy asur laharkiv osi ve'eschem olav. The soyer was strong, and it could have carried me and you on it as well. Later, the Gemara will explain that he didn't want to answer their question. His practice, Rabbi Eliezer practice, and this is not the only place in the Shas that you see this. You see this also in Masechah Sukkah, where he is presented with questions, the answer to which he actually knew, but he didn't want to say something that he did not hear from his Rebbe, from his teacher. He was very, he had great allegiance, we'll say, to a very direct type of transmission of the tradition, teacher to student, teacher to student. He didn't want to step out of line as far as he was concerned, at least, and he being very dedicated to that which he received from his Rabbonim. Only that is what he would transmit onwards, and not something otherwise. We continue in the Gemara. Chola mishalcho mahu shishalchenu biad acher. If the ish iti, the appointed person, became ill, can the goat be scented with someone else? Omar lahem, so Rabbi Eliezer answered, Ehei b'shalom ani v'atem. And if you look in the Maharsha on this, you'll see a very, very interesting commentary. But as we said, we're going to leave that for each one of you to look into themselves. He says, let us be in peace. Rashi, Ehei b'shalom ani v'atem, klomar ma lochem lishol al zos. Why are you asking me about this? Lo ani v'lo atem nizkak l'shilucho. We don't need this whole ritual. We're living at a time after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, so it's not something that is, you're asking something that is of no direct relevance to us. Another question. Let us say the goat was pushed off the cliff, namely its destination, and it did not die as it was expected to. Should someone go down there? Should the Ish-Iti go down there, descend the cliff, and kill it? Omar Lohem, Rabbi Eliezer responds, Ken Yovdu Kol Oyevecha Hashem. Thusly shall be destroyed all the enemies of Israel. The Chachamim Omrim. The Chachamim take a specific stand on these questions, and they say, Chola Markivo al Ksefo. If the animal became ill, it is to be carried out. Chola Mishalchoi, if the Ish-Iti took ill, Yishalchenu biyad acher. It shall be sent with someone else. Dochvoy velo meis, yered achro v'misen. If it was pushed off the cliff and did not die, so someone else should go down and kill it. So the three questions that Rebbe Lezer was asked, to which he didn't offer a direct response, the Chachomim respond to each one of them with a clear answer. Shalu es Rebbe Eliezer, a question was posed to Rebbe Eliezer, Ploni mahu le'olam haba. Question regarding so-and-so. Ploni is, in the text here, is not clear who they are asking about. Rashi has two pshatim. One says they were asking on someone, again, not clear who it is. Another pshat is they were asking about Shlomo ben David, King Solomon. Does he have a place in the world to come? As far as why ask about him, that itself is a rather broad topic, but suffice it to say that Shlomo HaMelech was in the eyes of many, and certainly when you learn the Tanakh, you see he did things that were of a questionable nature, to put it lightly, and hence room for asking this question. If you look in the Tosfos, so he has an additional pshat, quoting the Rabbeinu Hananel, and that is they were asking about Avshalom, the son of David HaMelech, who had intimacy with his father's concubines. How does that affect his Olam Haba status? We continue in the Gemara, Omar Lei, so that is Rebbe Eliezer responds, Lo Shaltuni Elo Alploni. You are not asking me about him, rather you're asking me about someone else. And Rashi here says the pshat that the name that the Rabbeinu Hananel gave in the first question, so Rashi says that maybe you were asking me about Avshalom. So following Rashi's approach, their original question was, what about Shlomo? And he said back to them, maybe you're really asking me about Avshalom. At this point, we have a note that's found in the Bach. So what we're going to do, we have a bracketed section that we've put in the Gemara. This entire section appears in the Bach in a somewhat clearer, with a clearer flow to it. So we're going to opt to read this section through the Bach, who's found on the side of your Gemara, and then when we get to the end of this bracketed section, so we'll go back into the Gemara text. So hopefully everyone is following where we are. We have a little star in the Bach commentary where we continue the reading. Uploni ma'ul olam haba. And they asked him, what about so-and-so with regard to his portion in the world to come? Omar lahem, lo sha'altuni elo al ploni. You didn't ask me about him, rather you asked me about someone else. Mahu, another question, Mahu lahatzil al kibso min ari. Is it mutter to save the sheep from the lion? We mentioned before that Rashi takes a very, almost a literal approach to this, in the sense that he doesn't offer explanations for the questions. Here, we will just make a very superficial reference to that which you can find in the Marsha, where there is a question, there's a hint over here to the incident involving Bathsheba and David HaMelech, Bathsheba being portrayed as the sheep, and that is in fact found in the scriptures themselves, where Nosan Hanavi, the prophet Nosan, presented the Bathsheba issue to David in a veiled way, referring to a sheep, the Ari, the lion, being David HaMelech. In fact, in the second parak of Maseches Shabbos, there seems to be a reference to David HaMelech also using an Ari, lion analogy. Anyway, we continue in the Bach reading of the Gemara. Rabbi Elazar had been asked, can you save the sheep from the lion? Omar lahem, lo sha'altuni elo al haroya. You were asking me not about the sheep, but about the shepherd. And the shepherd might be, again, if you look in the Marshal, you'll see he makes reference to the Uriah, the husband of the original husband of Bathsheba, and his behavior with regard to David HaMelech, bringing in the question of Mored B'Malchus, where Uriah referred to his master as Yoav, the general in the army, and not the king, which seemed to indicate some type of change of allegiance on the part of Uriah. So, in that context, can he be saved from the hands of David HaMelech? Omar Lohem, Lo Sha'altuni, Rabbi Elazar says, Lo Shalti Elo Al Hakivson. You notice this is a circular type question-answer that is taking place, where he says at this point, you are not asking me about the Roeh, the shepherd, literally the shepherd, or he said maybe Uriah, you are asking me about the sheep. Another question, Mamzer, Mahu Lirash, and what is the din regarding a Mamzer? A Mamzer is a child who is born in a forbidden, from a forbidden parental relationship. A man had intimacy with a woman married to someone else, and she produced a child from that illicit union. That's one example of many of what a mamzer would be. And the question they posed him, does he have a right to inherit his father? And in the Gemara text itself, there are a series of questions regarding a mamzer. So you would go back to the Gemara text, and you see Mahu Liyabein, Mahu Losud as Beso, Mahu Losud as Kivro. And that you can see back in the Gemara text. Keeping one finger, though, on the Marsha, which we want to go back to the Marsha. The questions involved is a mamzer, if he is a surviving brother from a brother who died leaving no children, does he marry the widow in attempt to fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum? Mahu Losud es Beso, this question has to do with painting or whitewashing the walls of one's house. The Gemara in Bava Basra mentions that because the temple is in ruins, the Beis Hamikdash has been destroyed, Churban Abayis, so our practice is not to completely or with a high quality whitewashing of one's house walls. So the Rashi here says, "Ma losud es beso bisman hazeh mi osur mipnei tzar churban abayis." Is it forbidden to have his walls whitewashed in order to acknowledge or memorialize the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash? And Mahu Losud es Kivro. This too is a subject of discussion in the Marsha. What about putting lime, which is a white material, on his grave? The Gemara goes on to say, Lo mipnei shefligon bidvarim. Rabbi Elazar's avoidance isn't because he was trying to give them a runaround. Elo mitnei shelo omar davar shelo shama mipi rabo me'olam. Rather, it's a reflection of his practice of not relating to others something that he did not hear directly from his instructors. Now, we should go back to the Bach, try to find where we left off when we were reading the Bach. The Bach had mentioned Losud es Kivro, Umau Losud es Kivro, Umau Losud es Beso, Lo mitnei shefligun bedvorim, Elo, etc. Venira b'einai, Omar HaKosev, B'tosefta Perikimol Divomus. And here, the Bach does reveal some of the meaning behind some of these questions. So let's continue reading in the Bach together. Nira de al mamzer shoalu, the question was asked regarding a mamzer. Ishori losud es beso, is it mutter for him to whitewash the walls of his house? Deshemel yeshlo lis abel al sheposul hu lovo bakol. This is a pshat that's different than the Rashi pshat. Rashi tied this into the Churban Beis Hamikdash. Here, it's a question concerning his illegitimacy, his prohibition of entering the nation of Israel. A mamzer, is not allowed to marry a Jewish girl from the common ranks of the Jewish people. Here we're not going to get into details of who a mamzer is allowed to marry, but a basic regular Jewess is something forbidden for a mamzer to marry. Likewise, a girl that's a mamzeres, she cannot marry into the rank and file of the Jewish people. As a result of this, the concept of mourning, of bemoaning and mourning his status, maybe that should be reflected by a restriction imposed on the mamzer from whitewashing the walls of his house. The Alzeh Heshiv, regarding this, Rabbi Lezer says, Ma'u losud es kivro. What about applying lime to his grave? The kevan shu posel, since he is unfit, he is disqualified, it's illegitimate. Ein oisin loy kavod b'moso. We don't bestow any honor upon him upon his death. Kedei she eker shezaro posel, so that it should be obvious that his offspring, that this person, who, if he left any descendants, are all illegitimate, and which is the rule of the Torah, that a mamzer is someone whose status of illegitimacy is perpetuated through his descendants. The Bach adds that we're not talking here about the practice of pouring lime over a grave l'shem tziyun in order to demark it so as to enable Kohanim to avoid defilement. So there had been, the Gemara mentions in Moed Katan, that lime was poured over graves so as to make it clear that here someone is buried. It could very well be, given that they didn't have head markers, as is quite common in cemeteries, but rather a rather unrecognizable grave on the ground, so lime would be poured to serve as a demarcation. All that the same, this Gemara is not referring to that form of lime application, but rather a form of whitewashing graves, which would have been a sign of honor, so the mamzer, does not deserve that. As he says, as the Bach goes on to say, this is not a reference to the whitewashing or the lime application l'shem tziyun tivisa reish perik mashkin, the beginning of perik mashkin in Moed Katan, elo tichas sid shahoyu oisin likvorim l'shem kavod, but rather it was a coating of a grave with sid, this lime material, as a sign of honor. Upirish Rashi kan hu tamua. The Bach says that Rashi's explanation in this Gemara is something that raises wonderment. Let us turn back now to the Gemara text. We're picking up now with the next crown shape. Shalo isho chachomes Rebbe Lezer. A wise woman posed a question to Rebbe Lezer. Me'achar shemaiso egel shovin in the Exodus from Mitzrayim, there was the unfortunate incident of the construction of the golden calf and its subsequent worship. Many people had violated the halacha in worshiping it. Many different forms of activity were done, and yet we find that they all fall under the general heading, if you will, of, we'll say, maybe a form of idolatry. So, Rashi says, all of their different activities, though, are all equal with regard to their prohibition. Why then, why is it that when you look in the psukim of the Torah, the death that was meted out to the different people was in fact not the same, wasn't a uniform form of capital punishment? Rashi elaborates here, and if you see in the Rashi, there were three different kinds of death that the Torah reveals. Sayef is death at the hands of the sword. Simu ish charbo. The pasuk mentions that after Moshe Rabbeinu discovered the violation of the golden calf, so he says, was speaking to the tribe of Levi, and he says, each one gird yourselves with the sword and kill those who worshipped the Egel Hazov. We also find Misas Magefa, death at the hands of a plague. The pasuk says, Vayigoyf Hashem es ha'om. We find Misas Hedroiken, death as a result of a disease known as Hedroiken. Dichti Vayizer al Pnei Hamayim Ramil Seches Avodah Zarah Loneskav Moshe Levoikom Kesaitis Belitzvos Beten. The death of a sota is through a form of death associated with Hedroiken, that type of disease, without getting into any details. Nevertheless, there is a reference in the psukim to that form of death as well. So you see three different forms of death for what would appear to be a singular violation of idolatry. That was the question that this wise woman posed to Rebbe Eliezer. Why do we find different deaths when Maisa Egel when there was uniform violation of Egel Hazov? Omar Law, Rebbe Eliezer says back, Ein chochma leisha elo bepelech. The wisdom of a woman is in her spinning of wool. V'cheinu omer v'chol isha chachmas leiv biyodea tavu. This pasuk is a reference to a high level of skill that apparently women had at the time of the construction of the Mishkan. They were able to spin the wool for the production of fabrics and the use of them in the Mishkan, which demanded some type of high-level intelligence and skill. So Rebbe Eliezer is mentioning that the wisdom of women is found in the pelech, that's the device used in spinning of wool. Here, the Gemara itself refers to the incident involving the Egel and gives direct explanations why the different deaths. Itma Rav v'Levi. Chad Omar, one says, Zibeach b'kiter b'sayef, Gibeif v'nishek b'misa, Somach b'libo b'hedroiken. The three different forms of death that we saw in Rashi are explained as, if Zibeach b'kiter, number one was the slaughtering and burning of sacrifices to the Egel Azov, their death was through Sayef, at the death of the sword. They were killed by what's called Misas Cherev, or Sayef. Sayef is a sword. Kipei v'nivshek has to do with their hugging and kissing the Egel Azov, so they died at B'misa, the plague. And Samach B'libo, those who were happy, B'levovo, Samach B'levovo, that were happy with the incident, they suffered Hedroiken. V'chad Omar, the other opinion, we had two names, Rav and Levi. So one said what we just learned, and the other says, Eidim v'hasra b'sayef. If there were witnesses who issued a warning to the violator, and they nevertheless violated in this deliberate fashion, they were killed b'sayaf. In order to carry out a court-oriented or court-based death penalty, the court does not act unless there is, in addition to witnesses, they also served a warning. Eidin below hasra, if there were witnesses but there was no hasra, there was no warning before the act, so there, Beis Din cannot act in a proactive fashion, so b'misa, they died at the hands of a plague. Lo eidin below hasra, if there were no witnesses and there was no warning, behadroiken, they suffered the hadroken disease, which seems to have led to their death. Omar Rav Yehuda, shivto shel Levi lo ovad avodas kechavim. Rav Yehuda says that the tribe of Levi was not involved in idolatry. Idolatry in the context of the golden calf. Shneimar vayamoid Moshe b'shar hamachne. The pasuk goes on to say, now here you can see under the Gemara text there's a base where the quotation continues, Vayomer mi Lashem Elai vayosvu alav kol b'nei Levi. Upon seeing the disaster of the Egel Azov, Moshe Rabbeinu says, who is loyal to the Almighty, and he was loyal to the Almighty, come to me. And they're gathered around Moshe, all of the tribe of Levi. So as far as Rav Yehuda is concerned, he looks at the pasuk and he comes to the conclusion that Bnei Levi were not in violation of the Egel Hazov. Yosef Ravina v'Komer Laha Shmaitza. We're continuing the Gemara. You can see the second wide line. Ravina said over this teaching, Esvei Bnei Rav Papa Bar Abba LeRavina. The sons of Rav Papa asked Ravina. There is a pasuk that says Ulalevi Omar, etc. Ha'omer la'aviv u'le'imo lo ro'isiv. This is a pasuk from the Maisa Egel, and the pasuk indicates that when Moshe Rabbeinu called out to all the loyal ones, so there were people from the tribe of Levi that gathered with him, and they showed no mercy on anyone who violated, including their own next of kin, their own near close relatives, where the pasuk indicates they didn't see their father nor their mother. In other words, they had no compassion on anybody. But the pasuk indicates father of a Levi, he is also a Levi. All next of kin of a Levi are Levium. So you see that amongst the tribe of Levi, there were Levis that were in violation as well. You had Levi killing Levi. The Gemara answers, not so. The term Ovav in the pasuk that we just read equals Avi Imoi Yisrael. It's a reference to not literally his own father, but his mother's father. His mother's father might have been from Yisrael. In other words, you have a Levi who married the daughter of a non-Levi. So who was being killed in this pasuk is the Levi would have ended up killing his maternal grandfather who violated the Egel Azov. Achiv, the reference to Achiv in that pasuk equals Achiv me'imoi mi-Yisrael. A man has a brother, but through a common mother, two different fathers. So you have a lady that was married on the one hand to a Levi, so that child is a Levi, and that same woman was also married on a different occasion to a non-Levi, producing Yisrael. So the Levi ended up killing his brother, but a brother through a common mother, and that fellow being a non-Levi. Bonov, which is also referred to in the pasuk, B'nei Bito Mi-Yisrael. It's a reference to his grandsons, to a Levi's grandsons, where the Levi's daughter married a non-Levi, producing grandchildren that were non-Levium. But as far as someone who was a purebred Levi, or I should say a licensed Levi, a formal Levi, someone who carried the Levi label on him, none of them were in violation of the Egel Hazov. The kevesh osulo v'chulei mipnei habavlayim. We said shahoyu metalshin besaro. A special ramp was made in order for the scapegoat and the one accompanying it to exit the Azora, in order to avoid the Bavloyim, the Babylonians, who otherwise had this practice of ripping out the hair of the goat. Omar Ravo bar Barchana lo Bavloyim hoyu. Truth is, they were not Jews from Babylonia that were doing that. Elo Alexandrayim hoyu. They were Jews from Alexandria that used to do that. Because there was enmity between the residents of Israel and the Jews that lived in Babylonia, so any wayward behavior was associated with Babylonians, even though in this particular case it wasn't Babylonians who were guilty of this negative practice. Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda, Omer lo bavloim hoyu Alexandrim hoyu. Rabbi Yehuda in this Tanaic source says the same thing, that they were not Babylonians, they were really Alexandrians. Omar lo Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi, upon hearing Rabbi Yehuda saying this, so he says, Tanuach daitcho shinachtas daiti. You should have comfort because you enabled me to feel comfort. It's pointed out that Rabbi Yossi comes from a family whose origins were in Babylonia, and he was previously upset with his ancestors being associated with this kind of wayward behavior, but upon hearing that they really weren't the practitioners of this, he felt comforted. Tul v'tzei Tona, the Brisa elaborates on the Mishnah that said, take him and get out. What were they saying when they were pulling out its hair and trying to rush him out of the Beis Hamikdash? Ma shoi safira dain v'chovi dora sagin. What are you doing? Delaying. Shohi is to delay. Sfira is the goat. This goat. What are you hanging around with this goat for? While the sins of Israel, that's the chovi dora, the sins of the generation sagin, are very great. So they were very interested in rushing him out of there as quickly as possible. We continue with the Mishnah. Yekirei Yerushalayim hoyu melavin oisei ad sukkah harishona. Yekirei Yerushalayim are the choshuv, the important citizens of Jerusalem. They practiced accompanying the ish iti with the goat out to ad sukkah rishona, until the first hut. There were huts that were set up en route to the cliff from which the sawyer was pushed off. So from Jerusalem to the first hut located outside Yerushalayim, the Chosheва citizenry, the important citizenry of Jerusalem, would accompany the Ish Iti till that first hut. Eser Sukkos Yerushalayim v'ad Suk. There were 10 huts set up from Jerusalem till the cliff. And we're going to see later in the Gemara there are different opinions on this topic of numbers, but this Mishnah is telling us there were 10 huts from Yerushalayim, lining the route from Yerushalayim to the cliff. We continue at the top of Samach Zayin Omed Aleph, Tishim Ris. The total distance was 90 ris. Ris is a measure of distance. Shivo emechza l'chol mil. Each ris, or we should say a meal. A meal is a distance of 2,000 amos, approximately a kilometer. So each meal contained 7.5 ris. So if you want to know how many meal there were, you would take the number 90, and we know that that 90 ris, each ris represented, or actually we should say each meal represented 7.5 ris. So you have 90 ris divided by 7.5. That gives you 12 meal. So it'll be 12 kilometers from the Beis Hamikdash till the cliff. Al kol sukkah v'sukkah oimrim lo at each hut when this ish iti would arrive. So there were people that inhabited these huts from before Yom Kippur. So you have the residents of these huts telling the Ishiti as he arrived at each one of them, Harei Mozon v'Harei Mayim. They'd say, yeah, we've got food here and we've got water. Of course, it's Yom Kippur. Everyone is required to fast. And yet they announced this. And we'll see later why they told him that we've got food and drink over here. He was accompanied from booth to booth, from hut to hut, chutz me'achron shebahem, with the exception of the last one, she'eno magia imo latzuk. No one would accompany him from the last hut till the cliff. In fact, if you make the necessary calculations, and you can see this, the calculations are in the Rashi itself, being that we're dealing with a distance of 12 mil and sukkahs and booths. There were 10 booths. Each sukkah, the gap between each sukkah was 1 mil. So if you have 10 booths, there are 9 gaps between each booth. So the distance from sukkah to sukkah, if you count the total distance, you would account for 9 of the 12 mil. The first meal was from Jerusalem to the sukkah. And we have to mention that when it comes to laws of walking outside of a settled area on Shabbos, one is limited to a distance of 2,000 amos. 2,000 amos is 1 meal. So if a person was going to walk away from where he was, if he's going to want to be able to get back, he can't venture more than 1 meal or more than 2,000 amos from his location. So from Jerusalem to the first hut there was 1 meal. So those who accompanied him to that first hut, they could go back home to Yerushalayim. And likewise from hut to hut. So going from Yerushalayim till the end of all of the 10 huts, that would account for 10 meal. But there are 2 more. Didn't we say there were 12 meal total? So from the last hut to the cliff, there was a balance left of 2 meal. 2 meal is beyond the Tchum of Shabbos. It's beyond the distance a person is allowed to walk. Of course, other than the Ish Iti, that supersedes these halachas. But as far as the hut residents were concerned, we said in the Mishnah just now that he was being accompanied from hut to hut, or from place to place, with the exception of the last hut dwellers that were not able to reach the tzuk. They were not able to reach the cliff. As we said a moment ago, the distance between the last hut and the cliff was 2,000 amos. By the way, we have a little chart on the side of the Gemara that illustrates that which we are saying right now. The chart is designed to illustrate Shitas Rebbe Meir that will appear in the Gemara. As we said, there are several Shitos on this. Our Mishnah represents Rebbe Meir's approach, and as far as the last mile, so to speak, it's not a mile, it's 2 kilometers. That last distance, so he had to walk it alone, almost all. He had to walk half of that last distance alone. The Mishnah mentions, as we just read, reading again the third line from the top, the last 2 words, chutz me'achron sheben, with the exception of the last hut, she'eno magi imo l'tzuk. They didn't reach the tzuk with him. They were able to walk 2,000 amos, one of the 2 meals that were left. So they walked 1 meal with him, leaving him 1 kilometer to walk on his own. And what happened at that point, whoever was accompanying him from the last hut would stand at a distance, and the distance is 1 meal away from the cliff, and they would see what he is doing. Ma hoya oisa, what did he do? What did the Ish Iti, the accompanying man, do with the goat when he reached the cliff? Chaylek lashon shel zahiris, there was a strip of crimson wool, was dyed red. That's the lashon shel zahiris, and he took this strip and divided it into half. Chetzio koshur besela, the chetzio koshur bein shnei karnov. 1 half of the strip he tied to a rock that was by the edge of the cliff, and the other half he tied to the horns of the goat. The dochvo lachorov, and he shoved the goat off. Lachorov means shoved it backwards off the cliff. Whom is galgal the yored, it would roll down It didn't reach even halfway down until it became dismembered by the impact and the sharp rock protrusions or whatever was there at this cliff. It served to rip it into shreds, into limbs, and that was its fate. The Ish-Iti then returned to the last hut until the end of Yom Kippur, until darkness. Now we know that that there is tumas begodim. There's a form of clothing impurity that sets upon the Ish-Iti, the Meshaleach. So at what point did clothing impurity set upon him? So here there are two opinions. One opinion says that upon his leaving the wall of Jerusalem, Shimon Omer Mishas Dechiyosu, only from the time it was pushed off the cliff. We go on in the Gemara briefly, even though we've gone over our Daf Yomi limit, but nevertheless, this next source is directly related to the issue of the huts that we were just talking about, so we'll just continue with this. Tanu Rabbanon, Eser Sukkos, Ushneim Osar Milin Hoyu. This is the approach we already saw in the Mishnah. We explained it, 10 huts along the way, a total of 12 meal. Divrei Rebbe Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Teisha Sukkos, the Asora Milin. Rabbi Yehuda has a different approach. He says that there were 9 sukkos that lined the way, and there was a total of only 10 meal from Yerushalayim to the cliff. Rabbi Yossi Omer Chomesh Sukkos, the Asora Milin Hoyu. There were 5 booths lining the way, and there was a total of 10 meal distance. Now you'll ask, well then, how can he be accompanied if the purpose of these huts is to have offer accompaniment for the Ish-Iti on his journey? How could 5 booths accommodate that when you're dealing with a distance of 10 meal? You would end up having 2 meal between each booth. So the answer to that is the Kulon Ayadei Eruv. Eruv is a reference here to Eruv Tchumen, which is a halacha that enables a person to extend his tchum, his 2,000 amo walking distance, by an additional maximum 2,000 amos in a specific direction, by placing food at the 2,000 amma mark from wherever you are located, so that if between 2 booths there was 4,000 amos, 4,000 amos is 2 meal, the residents, or some of the residents of a booth, would place some food 1 meal away from their booth, enabling them to go an additional meal. So he would have accompaniment from one booth to the next. Omar Rebbe Yossi, Soch li Elazar beni. Rabbi Yossi says that my son told me. The Rashi adds that the word soch li, literally sicha, is a conversation, but Rashi says Beloshen schok al vorai. He responded to me in an offhanded way, in a laughing fashion, and maybe a derisive fashion. He says the son of Rabbi Yossi said to his father, if you're going to introduce Eruv into the equation, well, im al yedei Eruv, if Eruv is being used, Yochoni lasos afilu shtei sukkos the asora milin. I could set it up where you would have only 2 booths along the 10 meal route. And Rashi explains how if by using an Eruv, you're enabling a distance of 4,000 amos to be covered. So, and you have a distance of 10 meal to be covered. Well, 2 booths, that will already account for a distance of 8,000 meal, and the balance of 2 meal left to complete 10 meal. So you've got to have 1 meal to the first sukkah, and then 1 meal from the last sukkah to the cliff. and you've accomplished everything you need by way of providing accompaniment for the ish iti. Keman az laho desanya. We have a source that has no name, and we want to know according to whom we have so far seen Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi. According to whom would the following source comply? It says, Chutz me'achron shebohen shelo higia imo letzuk elo oime merochot v'roes ma'isov. Now that, in fact, is a quote from our Mishnah. In our Mishnah, there was no name. So it's interesting that in the Gemara it's presented as a brisa. But as I said, we saw this on the third line from the top of the Mishnah. We saw this same lashon. So it's interesting that the Gemara refers to this as desanya, but it would probably be a question that we could pose as far as the Mishnah is concerned as well. Who is the author of the Mishnah? Answer, Keman Rebbe Meir. This would work out only according to Rebbe Meir's cheshbonos. According to his calculations, this phase, only according to him would this last phase be appropriate, because according to his calculations, and we have our chart on the side to illustrate this, from Yerushalayim till the 10th booth, that accounted for 10 meal. The last 2 meal of the 12 meal total, that's of course according to Rebbe Meir, who said there were 12 meal, that could not be covered by the inhabitants of the sukkah, being that a person is limited on Shabbos and Kippur to traveling only 1 meal. So the last 2 meal, he would be accompanied maybe for 1 of the 2 meal, but the very last meal he would be left on his own. No one would go with him to there, but rather whoever was with him till that last meal would stand there and see what he is doing. So we asked, according to whom is that? Keman Rebbe Meir. This conforms to Rebbe Meir's approach, because as we said, according to Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, you would not, the last meal, in fact, he could have had accompaniment for that. Before we conclude, we want to remind you that if you wish to be in touch with us, we can be reached at gmarkings@gmail.com. With that, we conclude our Shiur for today.